most of the reforms that are needed to prevent the type of violence and injustices that we've seen take place at the local level. It is mayors and county executives that appoint most police chiefs and negotiate collective bargaining agreements with police unions. And that determines police practices in local communities. It's district attorneys and state's attorneys that decide typically whether or not to investigate and ultimately charge those involved in police misconduct.
So, and that's what I want to talk about now here, because President Obama hit it on the head. Certainly, we are at a chapter of history where there's an opportunity, if you want to find the half full of this tragedy, for real change here. But where will the change come from? What will it look like? Who will be the people who have to drive that change? Obviously, the president weighing in on the death of George Floyd and how we take this next step as a country. My next guest wants to be one of those local leaders that the president is talking about. And she's got an interesting background and perspective on it. Former federal prosecutor Mimi Rocah. She's running for in the Democratic primary for district attorney of Westchester County. And for those of you watching us from outside of New York, it's a county of about 1 million people here, from everything from urban areas to suburban areas, even some rural parts. So it really is reflective of a microcosm of a much broader area. So speak to, if there's going to be change out of this, and I know you believe the change is overdue on this end. Yes, maybe nationally, a president could choose to give leadership here. Obviously, we're not seeing that right now, as we just talked about. But what happens at the state or even at the DA level as to it changes from policing, prosecution, law enforcement, and justice?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really why I got into this race, a large part of it to begin with. I've been talking about this, unfortunately, for months now, and what the murder of George Floyd, which is, we need to say those words, is highlighting why I've been talking about some of these reforms that we need and the urgency of why we need them. What we're talking about is changing a culture here of tolerating police corruption and police brutality. And I say that as someone, who worked for 16 years in law enforcement, with law enforcement. I still call many of them my friends. I want to be back in law enforcement.
Can I interrupt you for a second? In the 16 years that you were a prosecutor, do you get a bad feeling when evidence comes across your way, or how either an arrest was handled or how a warrant was obtained? How, and I know you're going to go through your plan, but draw on personal experience, not by an individual case, but when you're on the side that you're trying to, basically inform justice, when did it not feel right? And what has to change through the food chain here until we get to the right conclusion?
Right. Well, and that's exactly the right question. What I talk about are red flags. Prosecutors in particular, and it is incumbent on the prosecutors. This is where, whatever prosecutor you are, federal prosecutor, state prosecutor, or county prosecutor, when you're working on a case, things come along that just don't feel right, that just give you a bad feeling. And that is when, and this is how I practiced as a prosecutor for 16 years, and prosecutors that I knew did, you drop everything. You stop whatever is going on, and you dig into those red flags. You don't run away from them. You dig into them. You jump into them. And you have to be open to the idea that something bad happened or mistakes were made, and even if it is someone that you think is a trustworthy law enforcement official. But that's part of what I'm talking about in terms of getting out of this culture of just, both within the police themselves, that we need to make it acceptable for police to report when they see misconduct. And then we as prosecutors absolutely need to be more open, more aggressive in pursuing and running down when we hear about misconduct. That's first and foremost.
Right now, this right side of justice agenda. Give tangible things, because we hear about qualified immunity, for example. One of the constant complaints we hear about is frustration on the part of people that there isn't transparency about either the officer involved or how we got to the point where what we saw happen. What kind of transparency should the public expect they don't get now?
Well, before we even get to transparency, I'll get to that in a second, but I think there's even something more basic than that we need to work on, and that's this kind of complicated relationship between the prosecutors, who would be the ones prosecuting the police if and when they do commit crimes, or investigating to figure that out, and the police, who are their partners in investigating other crimes. So one of the things that I'm doing, and that I wish all candidates for district attorney and all current district attorneys would do, and many are now, many progressive DAs are doing this, is not take donations, campaign donations from police unions. Not because police unions are inherently bad or evil or anything like that, but because it creates a conflict of interest. How can you take a campaign donation from a police union when the police union is, their job is to defend the rights and the privacy of the police? So in an investigative situation like this, they're going to be at odds with you. So that is something that many of us have called on all prosecutors to.
Should DAs investigate police in their district, or should it be farmed out to an independent prosecutor?
Look, as someone who hopes to be DA, I think that those are some of the most important cases that I hope to be able to bring, because when there is police misconduct, I think it is, that's one of the most important cases to be able to prosecute. I understand, though, that part of this is the public having faith in whoever's making the decisions about whether the prosecution can be brought or not. And there are some real questions about whether right now the public can have faith in some of the district attorneys out there. And so I think we need to have, there's a lot of different steps. I mean, you talked about transparency. So we need transparency both in terms of who the police are arresting, what kind of sentences people are getting, in the population, but then also transparency in terms of, and this is, a complicated area, but in terms of police personnel records and their records. I mean, we know in the murder of George Floyd that the officer who's been charged, Chauvin, had 18 complaints against him over his career. We don't know what those are right now, but were there warning signs in there that people should have been more transparent about? And so part of my plan is working on that transparency.
There was a stunning story that came out really in the last 24, 48 hours. It's not just the incidents, tragically, of violence that are now caught on camera. It's also, even when there's not a fatality involved, how there's miscarriages of justice sometimes. There was recordings made by an officer in the city of Mount Vernon, which is one of the bigger cities in the county. And in it, there was reportedly significant crimes about malfeasance of justice, setting up evidence against people, maybe even innocent people that were railroaded, etc. There's even audio of this as well. How troubling is it, and how big a part of making sure the policing is above board and that everybody's getting a fair shot, how much of that needs to be fixed as well in the system?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can draw a straight line from police misconduct to police brutality if it goes unaddressed. And what we've heard here in Westchester in the past 24 hours is that the DA's office, the current DA, was given recordings made by a whistleblower police officer alleging real misconduct, police brutality, planting evidence, falsifying evidence in Mount Vernon. Now, I am not saying, and I have not said since this came out, that those police officers should be charged based on what we know. What I'm saying is that this district attorney did not take those allegations seriously enough and continued to use those police officers in investigations, knowing that these allegations were pending and supposedly being investigated, and did not make disclosures to people who were getting arrested. That's how wrongful convictions occur. And his response to that was to say, well, people who were prosecuted and cases were made by those police officers, they can now bring claims of innocence. But that's not how this should be. We need to prevent the wrongful convictions in the first place. So it's about changing that culture. It's about when you get those kinds of allegations, you don't just go about business as usual. You have to be more transparent, as you said, meaning the DA's office needs to be transparent and say, whoa, wait a minute, we're hitting pause on using these officers right now. And I'm not saying every time that there's an allegation, but these were accompanied by really disturbing recordings that raise really serious allegations. And we also need to make sure that the investigations are being pursued aggressively. It's not just, well, we talked to one or two witnesses and that's it, and throw up our hands. These are the kind of investigations where the prosecutors should be aggressive.
For a lot of folks, they became familiar with you in the last couple of years with all the various investigations relating to this president and, again, abuses of power, et cetera, but also what was going on at the Department of Justice. We spent the better part of our A block talking about what was in General Mattis's extremely powerful, I thought, letter here as to the threat that he believes this country faces and the un-American actions and the unconstitutional threats by our president. But riding shotgun with him side by side was our Attorney General, who gave the order to legal American protesters who were sitting in a place before even a curfew was to be enacted, to have our military or our security forces literally clear them out with rubber bullets and tear gas. My point is, you're looking to be a district attorney. The current Department of Justice, how much does it, I don't know if worry is the right word, but how far we've fallen here from getting good leadership out of D.C.?
Yeah, well, I think it goes beyond worry. I mean, and a lot of us, you included, have been, ringing the alarm bells for years, not just on Trump, but on Barr, and saying how dangerous he is in some ways. I don't want to say more dangerous than Trump, but makes Trump so dangerous because it's the power of the Department of Justice behind him. And we saw that now in stark relief, because it is because he was the head of the Department of Justice that he could say, okay, clear this area out against peaceful, lawful protesters. And, he's been doing that all along in ways that maybe, average people didn't really see how out of place it was for the Attorney General to be doing certain things that he was doing. I hope now that they see how much he's wielding the power of the Department of Justice on behalf of a person, the president, not the presidency and the country, but on behalf of this person and looking out for him. And that is what is just so corrupt. And, look, a lot of things lately, including this, have really highlighted how much our local, county, state, governors, prosecutors are really our guards in a lot of ways from what's going on in Washington right now.
Well, the stakes are really high. And to that end, we've reached out to the sitting district attorney in Westchester, Anthony Scarpino. And I'll ask you, if we can put a debate together here, because at the end of the month, voters are going to have a decision to make. Would you want to sit down and do a debate?
Absolutely. I think it is so important, especially now more than ever. People have questions. They want to know, how are we going to fix this? And it would be great to discuss those answers.
And we'd like to provide that for our audience as well. So we will, again, extend the invitation to Mr. Scarpino in his office, and we'll pick that back up tomorrow as well. Mimi, thank you as always for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to see you.
All right, everyone. We'll be right back with more on RFL right after this.